deep in the Cascade Mountains, where cell towers don't reach and hiking trails disappear into ancient timber, Robert Chen thought he was seeking nothing more than solitude. The 62-year-old retired engineer had walked these paths for decades, finding peace in the whisper of wind through Douglas fir and the crunch of pine needles beneath his boots. But on this crisp October morning, the forest held something darker than shadows. The sound reached him first, a woman's scream cutting through the wilderness like a blade. Then he saw them. Two men dragging a young woman deeper into the woods, her desperate pleas echoing off the canyon walls. In that moment, Robert faced a choice that would unravel everything he thought he knew about justice, corruption, and the price of doing what's right. But what was the real reason those men wanted her silenced? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert's breath came steady and controlled as he assessed the situation from behind a massive cedar trunk. 20 yards ahead, two men held a young woman between them, one gripping her arms while the other rifled through a canvas messenger bag. The woman's dark hair was matted with blood, her hiking clothes torn, but her eyes still blazed with defiance. The larger man, thick-necked with calloused hands, wore expensive hiking boots that looked barely used. His companion was leaner, nervous, constantly glancing around the forest as if expecting company. Neither carried the casual gear of weekend hikers. These men had come here with purpose. Where is it? The thick-necked man demanded, shaking the woman roughly. The drive isn't in your bag. I told you I don't have any drive, she gasped. Robert felt muscle memory from his army days kick in. Assess the terrain. Count the weapons. Plan the approach. The nervous one carried a pistol poorly concealed under his jacket. The bigger man relied on brute force. But his attention was focused entirely on interrogating the woman. The forest floor offered advantages: fallen logs for cover, loose rocks for distraction, and most importantly, the element of surprise. Robert picked up a hefty stone and hurled it far to his left. The crash through the underbrush made both men spin toward the sound. "Tony, go check that out," the thick-necked man ordered. As Tony moved away from the group, Robert circled silently through the trees. His hiking boots, worn soft from years of mountain trails, made no sound on the pine needles. He reached Tony just as the man bent to examine the disturbed brush. Robert's arm wrapped around Tony's throat in a practice sleeper hold. The man struggled for 15 seconds before going limp. Robert lowered him quietly, removed the pistol, and checked for additional weapons. Tony's wallet revealed a driver's license, Anthony Castellano, with an address in Seattle. "Tony?" The remaining man called. "What did you find?" Robert picked up another stone and threw it deeper into the woods. "Just a deer, Marcus," he called back, disguising his voice. "Keep looking through her stuff." Marcus Webb. Robert committed the name from their conversation to memory as he moved closer. The woman's eyes widened when she spotted him approaching through the trees. But she had the presence of mind to keep quiet. Webb was built like a linebacker, probably 60 pounds heavier than Robert's lean frame. Direct confrontation wouldn't work. Robert needed to level the playing field. He emerged from the trees holding Tony's pistol with both hands, arms extended in proper firing stance. "Let her go. Now." Webb spun around, his hand moving toward his waistband, then freezing when he saw the gun pointed at his chest. "Easy there, old man. You don't want to get involved in this. I'm already involved. Step away from her. You don't understand the situation here." Webb's voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people. "This woman is a thief. We're recovering stolen property. Then call the police." Webb laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The police? That's rich." Robert noticed the woman's messenger bag on the ground, papers scattered around it. Among them, a press credential caught his eye. "Sarah Martinez, Seattle Independent." "A journalist." "Sarah," Robert said, not taking his eyes off Webb, "are you hurt badly?" "I'll survive," she managed. "But you need to know—" "Shut up," Webb snarled. "You've caused enough trouble. Whatever she's investigating, it's worth killing for," Robert observed. That tells me everything I need to know about who's in the wrong here. Webb's hand inched toward his weapon again. You're making a big mistake, old man. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Marcus Webb, according to your friend's phone conversation. And you're right, I don't know who you are. But I know what you are. The sound of Tony stirring in the underbrush made Webb glance away for a split second. Robert stepped forward, pressing his advantage. Sarah, can you walk? Yes. Then start moving toward the trail, slowly. As Sarah gathered her scattered papers and camera, Robert noticed her smartphone's cracked screen. Whatever evidence she'd gathered, it might still be accessible if the phone worked. This isn't over, Webb said, as Sarah moved past him. You just signed both your death warrants. That sounds like a threat. It's a promise. Robert waited until Sarah reached the main trail before beginning his own retreat. Webb made no move to follow, instead kneeling beside the groaning Tony. As Robert and Sarah hurried down the mountain path, he heard Webb speaking urgently into a radio. Are you really a journalist? Robert asked as they walked. Sarah nodded, wincing with each step. Investigative reporter. And what I found is going to bring down some very powerful people. That's why they tried to kill me. They weren't trying to steal something. They were trying to silence you. The question is, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, will either of us live long enough to tell the truth? The wail of sirens echoed through the canyon, 20 minutes after Robert's 911 call from the trailhead parking lot. Sarah sat on the tailgate of his pickup truck, pressing a torn piece of his flannel shirt against the cut on her forehead, while he gave their location to the dispatcher. 2 sheriff's department cruisers arrived first, followed by an ambulance and a fire department rescue truck. The response seemed unusually large for a simple assault call, especially in such a remote location. Deputy Morrison emerged from the lead vehicle, a thin man in his 40s with pale eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. His uniform was crisp, his boots polished to a mirror shine, not the appearance of someone who spent much time in actual wilderness patrol. Mr. Chen, I'm Deputy Morrison. You reported an assault? Robert nodded, helping Sarah to her feet as the paramedics approached. 2 men attacked this woman about 2 miles up the Cascade Trail. I intervened, and they fled when I showed them a weapon. Morrison's pen paused over his notepad. You were armed? I took a pistol from one of the attackers during the struggle. Where is this weapon now? Robert pointed to his truck. Unloaded, in my glove compartment. I have a concealed carry permit. The deputy's radio crackled with static, and Robert caught fragments of conversation about securing the scene and coordinating with the sheriff. Morrison stepped away to respond, speaking in low tones that carried an urgency Robert found curious. The paramedics began examining Sarah's injuries. She had a concussion, multiple bruises, and needed stitches for the head wound, but nothing appeared life-threatening. As they prepared to transport her to Regional Medical Center, Morrison returned with more questions. Miss Martinez, can you describe your attackers? Sarah's hand moved protectively to her camera bag. One was large, heavy-set, called Marcus. The other was smaller, nervous, named Tony. They were looking for something they thought I had. What kind of something? I don't know. They kept asking about a drive. Morrison wrote this down, but Robert noticed his grip on the pen had tightened. Are you visiting our area, Miss Martinez? I'm a journalist. I was researching a story about logging practices in the National Forest. The deputy's radio squawked again, and this time Robert clearly heard, Sheriff Donnelly wants a full briefing. Make sure you get all their contact information. Sheriff Blake Donnelly arrived as the ambulance was preparing to leave. A man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and a presence that filled whatever space he occupied. Donnelly wore his authority like a well-tailored uniform. His handshake was firm enough to be called aggressive. Mr. Chen, I understand you're quite the hero today. Something in the sheriff's tone suggested he didn't consider heroism necessarily a good thing. I did what anyone would do. Not everyone carries the skills to disarm 2 men single-handedly. Military background? Army, long time ago. Donnelly nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. His attention shifted to Sarah, who was being loaded into the ambulance. "Miss Martinez, we'll need a full statement once the doctors clear you. Deputy Morrison will follow up at the hospital." Sarah caught Robert's eye as the ambulance doors closed. Her expression held a warning he couldn't quite interpret. "Mr. Chen, I'll need you to come to the station for a complete statement," Donnelly said. "Paperwork, you understand. And we'll need to process that weapon as evidence." Of course, as Robert retrieved the pistol from his truck, he noticed Morrison examining Sarah's scattered papers with unusual interest. The deputy's badge caught the afternoon sunlight, and Robert saw something that made him pause. The badge appeared thicker than standard issue, with what looked like a small lens or sensor embedded in the metal. "Deputy Morrison has been with us for 8 years, Donnelly said, following Robert's gaze. "One of our most thorough investigators. He'll handle the follow-up personally." The way Donnelly emphasized personally sent a chill down Robert's spine. At the sheriff's station, Robert provided a detailed statement, but found himself omitting certain details: the specific conversation he'd overheard between Webb and Sarah, the professional nature of the attacker's equipment, and his growing suspicion that this was no random assault. "We'll canvass the area for your attackers," Donnelly assured him as Robert prepared to leave. "Though I suspect they're long gone by now. These drug-related incidents usually involve outsiders passing through drug-related. Miss Martinez was probably in the wrong place at the wrong time. Dealers use those remote trails for transactions. She likely stumbled onto something she shouldn't have seen." Robert nodded politely, but Donnelly's explanation felt rehearsed. As he drove toward the hospital, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sheriff had been more interested in what Sarah might have told him than in catching her. Attackers. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Robert pulled into Regional Medical Center, unaware that Deputy Morrison was already inside, asking very different questions than those in any standard assault investigation. Robert found Sarah in a private room on the 3rd floor. Her head wrapped in white bandages, an IV drip feeding into her left arm. She was awake but groggy, staring at the ceiling with the distant look of someone processing trauma and medication. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Like I got hit by a truck." Her voice was hoarse but stronger than he'd expected. "The doctors say I have a moderate concussion, but no serious brain damage." Lucky considering. A nurse entered to check Sarah's vitals, glancing at the medical chart clipped to the foot of the bed. Robert noticed the woman's frown as she read the notations, but she said nothing and left quickly. "Sarah, I need to ask you something. When Deputy Morrison was at the scene, you looked like you recognized him." Her eyes sharpened despite the medication. "I've seen him before. At the Cascade Timber offices in town. He was coming out of a meeting with their security chief 3 weeks ago, Marcus Webb." "You know him?" "He introduced himself when he was trying to kill you." Robert pulled his chair closer. "What exactly are you investigating?" Sarah struggled to sit up higher, wincing at the movement. "Cascade Timber Industries has been clear-cutting areas that are supposed to be protected watershed. But it's bigger than just environmental violations. They're falsifying federal environmental impact reports, bribing inspectors, and I think they're involved in something much worse." "Like what?" "I was tracking money flows through shell companies. Millions of dollars that don't match their logging revenues. I think they're laundering money for someone, using the timber operation as a front." Robert processed this information. "That would explain why they wanted you dead rather than just silenced. There's more." Sarah reached for her messenger bag on the bedside table, then stopped. "Wait, where's my bag?" Robert looked around the room. "I thought the paramedics brought it with you." Panic flickered across Sarah's face. "It had all my research notes, my backup camera, everything." "If they took it," the door opened and Deputy Morrison entered with a clipboard. His smile was professional but didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Martinez feeling better? I need to get your official statement about the incident." "Where's my bag?" Sarah asked directly. Morrison consulted his notes. "What bag would that be?" "My messenger bag. Canvas, brown leather straps. It was with me at the scene. I don't show any personal effects logged in our evidence inventory. Perhaps it was lost during the struggle. Robert studied Morrison's face. The deputy was lying, and not particularly well. I saw you examining papers from that bag at the scene. You must be mistaken. Mr. Chen, there were no papers. Sarah's medical chart lay open on the bedside table, and Robert glanced at it while Morrison consulted his clipboard. The medication dosages listed seemed unusually high for someone with Sarah's injuries. More concerning was a notation about blood, work that showed negative for all substances. When Robert clearly remembered the emergency room doctor mentioning elevated levels of something in her system. Miss Martinez, Morrison continued, can you think of any reason why these men might have targeted you specifically? Any enemies, disgruntled sources, romantic entanglements gone wrong? I told you they were looking for a drive. Some kind of storage device, but you don't have any such device. Sarah hesitated. No, Morrison made a note. Mr. Chen, I'll need you to come by the station tomorrow to sign your formal statement. We want to make sure we have all the details correct. After Morrison left, Sarah grabbed Robert's arm. He's lying about my bag. And look at this chart. She pointed to the falsified entries. Someone's covering their tracks. The blood work notation, what did they give you? I don't know, but I remember feeling dizzy before those men grabbed me, like I'd been drugged. I thought it was just fear, but now... She trailed off, looking at the chart again. Robert felt a cold certainty settling in his chest. This wasn't a random assault. They've been watching you, planning this, which means they know about you now too. Sarah's eyes were clear, despite the medication. Robert, you need to understand what you've gotten yourself into. The story I was investigating, it goes all the way to the top. Federal contracts, political campaigns, environmental crimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Then we need to get you out of here. I can't leave. Not yet. The doctors want to monitor me overnight because of the concussion. Then I'll stay. Sarah shook her head. You should go home. Act normal. They'll be watching both of us now. But if you seem like just a good Samaritan who's moving on with his life, maybe they'll leave you alone. Robert stood to leave, but paused at the door. Sarah, where is the real drive? The one they were looking for. She smiled for the first time since he'd found her in the woods. Hidden somewhere. They'll never think to look. Robert returned home to his modest ranch house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls as darkness settled over the valley. The motion sensor lights illuminated his driveway, but something felt wrong. His front door was slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered locking it before his morning hike. Inside, the disturbance was subtle, but unmistakable to someone with his attention to detail. Books pulled slightly forward on shelves, desk drawers not quite closed, couch cushions repositioned. Whoever had searched his home was professional, but they hadn't expected an ex-soldier who noticed when things were out of place. His landline rang as he was checking the bedroom. The caller ID showed unknown number. Mr. Chen, you had quite an adventure today. The voice was gravelly, unfamiliar. But I think you've done enough playing hero for one lifetime. Who is this? A friend offering advice. Forget what you saw in the woods. Forget the woman. Go back to your quiet retirement and nobody gets hurt. Is that a threat? It's a promise. You have 24 hours to make the smart choice. The line went dead. Robert checked his answering machine. 3 similar calls had come in during the afternoon, each more explicit than the last about what would happen if he continued interfering in things that don't concern him. The next morning, Robert drove to the offices of the Seattle Independent, a small weekly newspaper housed in a converted warehouse in the Arts District. Sarah's editor, David Kim, was a thin man in his 30s with the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time staring at computer screens. Sarah's been working on the Cascade story for 6 months, David explained, leading Robert through a cluttered newsroom. She got a tip from an environmental scientist about suspicious logging activity in protected areas. What kind of tip? David pulled out a file folder. Water samples showing industrial contamination in streams that should be pristine. Aerial photos of clear cuts in areas marked as off-limits. But the real smoking gun was financial. He handed Robert a printed spreadsheet. Sarah discovered that Cascade Timber has reported revenues that don't match their actual timber sales. They're moving too much money for a regional logging operation. Money laundering? That's what we think. But for who? And how does it connect to the environmental violations? David's phone rang, and he glanced at the caller ID with obvious relief. "Sarah's calling from the hospital." Robert listened as David took the call, noting the editor's increasingly worried expression. When David hung up, his face was pale. The hospital discharged Sarah 2 hours ago, but she never called for a ride. Her phone goes straight to voicemail. Robert felt ice forming in his stomach. Someone took her, or she's hiding. Sarah's smart. If she felt threatened, she might have slipped out on her own. David pulled a business card from his desk drawer. "There's someone you should meet. Elena Rodriguez, environmental lawyer. She's been helping Sarah understand the legal implications of what she found." Elena Rodriguez's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building near the university. A woman in her 40s with graying hair and intense brown eyes, she greeted Robert with a firm handshake and immediate questions about Sarah's condition. "David told me what happened." "How much did Sarah tell you about her investigation?" "Enough to know it's bigger than just illegal logging." Elena nodded, pulling a thick folder from a filing cabinet. "Sarah brought me this last week. It's a USB drive hidden inside an old camera she picked up at a thrift store. She was paranoid about digital security, so she used analog hiding places. The drive contained months of Sarah's research, financial records, environmental reports, photographs of illegal logging sites, and most damning of all, recorded conversations between Cascade executives and local officials. "Listen to this," Elena said, connecting the drive to her laptop. The audio was scratchy but clear enough to understand. Marcus Webb's voice discussing the senator's concerns about timing and making sure the environmental reports pass federal review. Sheriff Donnelly's voice confirmed local law enforcement cooperation and assured Webb that any problems would be handled quietly. "This recording is from 3 weeks ago," Elena said. "Sarah was using a directional microphone from outside Cascade's main office." Robert studied the financial documents on Elena's screen. "These shell company transactions, they're not just laundering logging profits. No, look at the amounts. Cascade is moving $50 million a year through these accounts. Their entire timber operation couldn't generate that kind of revenue. So what's the real business?" Elena highlighted a series of entries. Federal environmental restoration contracts. Cascade has been awarded contracts to restore areas they've already illegally logged. They destroy the forest, then get paid by the government to replant it. Meanwhile, they're selling the timber and laundering money for someone else through the same operation. Robert's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging, or the reporter dies. This is your final warning." Elena saw his expression. "What is it?" "They have Sarah." Robert showed her the message. "And they know I'm still investigating. Then we need to move fast. If Sarah's alive, she won't be for long once they get whatever information they're after." Robert studied the evidence on Eleanor's computer screen. Cascade Timber wasn't just an environmental criminal. It was a sophisticated money laundering operation with connections that reached into federal contracts and local law enforcement. "How do we find her?" Elena was already reaching for her phone. "I know someone at the FBI who specializes in environmental crimes. It's time to bring in federal help. Will they believe us? With this evidence?" "They'd better, because if Cascade is willing to kill a journalist, they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who threatens their operation." Elena's contact at the FBI was Agent Maria Santos, a specialist in environmental crimes, who agreed to meet them at a coffee shop near the federal building. Santos was younger than Robert had expected, probably in her early 30s. But her questions were sharp and focused. "The evidence you've shown me is compelling. But I need to understand the scope," Santos said, reviewing printouts from Sarah's USB drive. "How deep does the corruption go?" Local law enforcement is definitely involved, Robert replied. Sheriff Donnelly and Deputy Morrison both have connections to Cascade, but the federal contract suggests this goes much higher. Elena spread out a collection of documents on the small cafe table. We spent yesterday researching property records and environmental impact studies. What we found is systematic fraud going back at least 5 years. She pointed to a faded survey map from 1978, its edges yellowed with age. This is the original watershed boundary survey for the Cascade National Forest. According to federal law, logging within these boundaries requires special permits and environmental oversight. Santos studied the map. But Cascade has been clear-cutting in these areas. Worse than that, they've been falsifying the boundary markers themselves. Eleanor pulled out recent photographs showing metal survey stakes that clearly didn't match the positions on the original map. They've moved the markers to exclude areas they want to log, then restored them afterward. Robert pointed to specific coordinates on the map. Sarah was investigating this section here when she was attacked. According to her notes, Cascade has diverted 3 streams to access timber in protected wetlands. That's a federal crime, Santos said grimly. Multiple federal crimes, actually, Elena nodded. But here's where it gets really interesting. The environmental restoration contracts Cascade receives to fix these areas. They're awarded without competitive bidding through a process that should require congressional oversight. Someone with serious political influence is protecting them, Robert concluded. Santos made notes in a small notebook. I'll need to coordinate with our financial crimes unit and the environmental protection division. This investigation will take time to... Her phone buzzed with an urgent text. As she read it, her expression darkened. There's been a development. A body was found this morning in the National Forest. Adult female, tentative identification as Sarah Martinez. Robert felt the world tilt. No, that's not possible. I'm sorry. The local coroner is handling the scene. But given what you've told me, I'm requesting federal jurisdiction over the investigation. Elena gripped Robert's arm. Wait, if they killed Sarah, why are they still threatening you? If she was dead, the threats would stop. Santos looked up from her phone. What threats? Robert showed her the text message from the previous day. They said they have Sarah. If she's dead, this message doesn't make sense. Unless the body isn't Sarah, Santos said slowly. Or unless they're using her death to make you back off. Elena was studying the 1978 survey map with renewed intensity. Robert, look at this. The coordinates where Sarah was attacked, they're marked on this original survey as a meeting point for surveying teams, meaning it's a natural clearing, hidden from main trails but accessible by multiple routes. Perfect for secret meetings. Elena traced her finger along the map. If Cascade is using remote forest locations for their business operations, this would be an ideal spot. Santos leaned forward. What kind of business operations? Think about it, Elena said. They're moving $50 million a year through their accounts. That's not just federal contract fraud. They're laundering money for someone, and they need secure locations to conduct transactions. Robert felt pieces clicking into place. Sarah stumbled onto more than environmental crimes. She discovered a money laundering operation using the National Forest as a base of operations, which explains why they tried to kill her instead of just intimidating her, Santos added. Environmental crimes might get you fined. Money laundering for organized crime gets you life in prison. Elena's phone rang. She answered, spoke briefly, then hung up with a grim expression. That was my contact at the coroner's office. The body they found? It's not Sarah Martinez. Relief flooded through Robert, followed immediately by renewed worry. Then where is she? The victim was identified as Linda Morrison, Deputy Morrison's wife. She was reported missing yesterday. Santos was already standing. This changes everything. If they're killing family members of their own people, either someone's cleaning house or there's internal conflict in the organization, or Morrison was about to turn on them, Robert suggested. Elena gathered the documents from the table. Either way, Sarah is still out there somewhere. The question is whether she's hiding or being held prisoner. Robert studied the survey map one more time, focusing on the remote areas marked with elevation changes and water sources. If I were hiding in that forest, where would I go? Somewhere with fresh water, shelter from weather, and multiple escape routes, Santos said. Elena pointed to a cluster of symbols on the map. There, old-growth timber stands with natural caves formed by root systems. The survey notes mentioned significant geological features in this area. Santos checked her watch. They can have a search team ready in 2 hours, but we'll need local cooperation, which means working with Sheriff Donnelly. That's not an option, Robert said firmly. Donnelly is part of the conspiracy. Then we do this unofficially. Elena, can you guide us to these cave systems? Elena nodded. But if Sarah is being held prisoner instead of hiding, we'll be walking into a trap. Robert was already heading for the door. Then we'd better make sure we're ready for one. Robert returned, home that evening to find his front window shattered, and a message spray-painted across his living room. Wall. Last warning, glass, crunched under his boots as he surveyed the damage. This time, the intruders hadn't bothered with subtlety. His answering machine blinked with 7 new messages. The first few were hang-ups, but the 4th message made his blood run cold. Sarah's voice strained and frightened. Robert, if you're listening to this, don't come looking for me. They have me, and they'll kill both of us if you don't stop. Please, just walk away. The background noise in the recording caught his attention, the sound of running water and what might have been machinery. Not the natural sounds of a forest location. As Robert was cleaning up the glass, his phone rang. Elena's voice was urgent. My office was broken into last night. They took everything. Computers, files, even my coffee maker. But they missed something. What? I had Sarah's research backed up on a personal cloud server. And Robert, I found something we missed before. A photograph. 20 minutes later, Robert met Elena at an all-night diner across town. She slid a printed photograph across the table, slightly blurred, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed Sheriff Donnelly shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit outside Cascade Timber's main office. Sarah took this 3 weeks ago. But look at the background. Elena pointed to the corner of the image. Behind the 2 men, partially visible through a window, was Marcus Webb in conversation with someone whose face was obscured by shadows. But the figure held something that caught the light, an object that looked distinctly like the handle of a fire poker. The photo is burned around the edges, Robert noticed. Where did you find this? In Sarah's camera bag, the one they claimed was never recovered. Someone tried to destroy it, but the metal housing of her camera protected this one image. Robert studied the photograph more carefully. This was taken the same day Sarah called you about accelerating her investigation timeline, 2 days before she was attacked. Elena's voice was grim. She knew they were getting suspicious. Robert's phone buzzed with another text message. Check Channel 7 News. Your journalist friend has something to say. They found a television in the diner's back room. The late news was running a story about Sarah Martinez, showing her hospital photo alongside footage of her being loaded into an ambulance. But the story wasn't about her attack. Seattle investigative reporter Sarah Martinez was arrested today on charges of falsifying environmental data and extortion, the anchor announced. Police say Martinez fabricated evidence against local businesses as part of an elaborate blackmail scheme. The report showed Sheriff Donnelly at a press conference, explaining how his department had uncovered Sarah's pattern of journalistic fraud and her attempts to shake down legitimate businesses with manufactured environmental violations. They're destroying her credibility, Elena whispered. Deputy Morrison appeared on screen holding up evidence bags. We recovered false documents and fabricated photographs from Ms. Martinez's residence. The investigation is ongoing, but we believe she was working with accomplices to defraud multiple companies. Robert felt sick. They're not just silencing her. They're making sure no one will believe anything she says if she surfaces. Elena's phone rang. She answered, listened briefly, then hung up with a stricken expression. That was my paralegal. Someone called the State Bar Association. Today, claiming I'm under federal investigation for conspiracy and evidence tampering. They're going after everyone connected to Sarah's investigation. There's more. Agent Santos tried to reach me this afternoon. Her supervisor pulled her off the case, citing jurisdictional concerns and potential conflicts of interest. Robert stared at the burned photograph. They have people everywhere. Local law enforcement, the media, probably federal agencies too, which means we're on our own. The diner's television switched to a weather report, but Robert's attention was caught by the banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Environmental lawyer Elena Rodriguez under investigation for evidence tampering in connection with fraudulent journalist Sarah Martinez. Elena saw it too. My reputation is destroyed. Even if we prove everything later, who's going to believe us now? Robert's phone rang. Unknown number again. Enjoying the show, Mr. Chen. The same gravelly voice from before. Your little team is falling apart. The reporter is discredited, the lawyer is under investigation, and you're about to join them. What do you want? Sarah Martinez has information that belongs to us. When she gives it back, this all goes away. Until then, everyone she's contaminated with her lies will pay the price. I don't know where she is, but you're going to find her. Because if you don't, we'll frame you for Deputy Morrison's wife's murder. We have your fingerprints on the weapon that killed her. The line went dead. Robert stared at his phone, remembering the pistol he'd taken from Tony Castellano. Elena was watching his face. What is it? They're going to frame me for Linda Morrison's murder. The gun I took from Sarah's attacker, they must have used it to kill Morrison's wife. Then we need to find Sarah before they find us. Robert looked at the burned photograph again, studying every detail. Elena, this machinery noise in Sarah's phone message. What if she's not in the forest at all? Where else would they take her? Somewhere with running water and industrial equipment. Somewhere they could conduct their real business while using the logging operation as cover. Eleanor's eyes widened. Cascade's lumber mill. It's been shut down for months. Supposedly for equipment upgrades. Perfect. Place to hold someone prisoner while they work on breaking her down for information. Robert's grandfather's cabin sat 15 miles up a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Built in 1952 by a man who'd survived Normandy Beach and wanted nothing more than solitude. The small structure was invisible from any main road and accessible only to someone who knew exactly where to look. Elena followed Robert's pickup truck in her sedan, both vehicles bouncing over ruts and fallen branches as they climbed deeper into the mountains. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend, rough-hewn logs, darkened by 60 years of weather, a stone chimney, and windows that reflected the forest like watching eyes. Your grandfather built this, Elena asked as they parked. After he came back from the war, said he needed a place where the only sounds were natural ones. Robert unlocked the heavy wooden door with a key that showed its age. He lived up here for 6 months every year until he died. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but well-maintained. A wood-burning stove, a simple kitchen, bookshelves lined with military history and survival manuals. On the mantel above the fireplace, a Purple Heart medal rested in a frame beside a faded photograph of soldiers in World War II uniforms. Elena examined the medal with reverence. He earned this at Normandy? Omaha Beach. Took shrapnel in his leg but kept advancing. Robert touched the frame gently. He used to tell me that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. Eleanor set her laptop on the kitchen table and began reviewing Sarah's research files. If we're right about the lumber mill, we need to understand the layout before we try anything. Robert studied architectural plans he'd found online. The Cascade Mill was a sprawling complex of buildings connected by conveyor systems and service roads. Multiple entrances, but also multiple places where armed guards could control access. Elena, there's something I haven't told you about what happened in those woods. She looked up from her computer. What? When I confronted Marcus Webb, he wasn't surprised to see me. He knew my name, my background. They've been watching me for longer than just since Sarah's attack. Why would they be watching you? Robert pulled out his wallet and showed her a business card that had been slipped under his door months earlier. I thought this was spam, but now I'm not sure. Someone wanted to hire me as a consultant for security assessment of remote properties. The card was expensive stock. Embossed lettering, Mountain Security Solutions, discretion guaranteed. They were recruiting you, or testing me. Maybe they wanted to know if I'd be a problem before they escalated their operations. Robert set the card on the table. Which means they know about this cabin. Elena closed her laptop. Then we can't stay here long. Long enough to plan our next move. Robert opened one of his grandfather's survival manuals. But first, I need to understand exactly what Sarah discovered that made them willing to kill for it. Elena reopened Sarah's research files. The financial records show Cascade moving money through accounts in 3 countries. But there's a pattern here I missed before. She pointed to transaction dates on her screen. These large transfers happen every 3 months. Always the same amounts, always to the same set of shell companies. Quarterly payments. More like scheduled deliveries. Sarah's notes mention product shipments that don't match any timber export records. Robert studied the data. What kind of product? I don't know. But whatever it is, it's worth $50 million annually and requires the kind of security that includes killing journalists. The Purple Heart caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. Robert thought about his grandfather's stories of ordinary men forced to make extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances. Elena, if we're wrong about this, if we go to that mill and Sarah isn't there, we'll have exposed ourselves for nothing, and if we're right and we don't try, she dies. Robert opened another of his grandfather's books. This one about resistance movements in occupied Europe. The margins were filled with his grandfather's handwritten notes about courage, sacrifice, and the price of standing up to tyranny. My grandfather spent 2 years fighting people who thought they were above the law, Robert said. He used to say that evil succeeds when good people convince themselves they're not strong enough to fight it. Elena looked at the medal, then at Robert. So we fight, but we do it smart. Robert spread the mill's architectural plans across the table. If Sarah is being held there, she's probably in the administrative building. Isolated, but with access to the equipment they'd need for interrogation. How do we get in without getting killed? Robert smiled grimly, touching his grandfather's Purple Heart. We use what they don't expect from a retired engineer and an environmental lawyer. Which is the kind of tactical planning that wins wars. Elena's phone buzzed at dawn with an encrypted message from a contact she'd cultivated at the Federal Election Commission. The message contained a single attachment, a PDF file that made her blood run cold as she read it in the grey morning light filtering through the cabin windows. Robert, wake up. You need to see this. Robert emerged from the back room where he'd spent a restless night on his grandfather's cot. Elena had her laptop open, displaying campaign finance records that painted a picture far more complex than simple environmental crimes. Senator Patricia Wells has received over $2 million in campaign contributions from shell companies connected to Cascade Timber, Elena said. But that's not the worst part. She scrolled to another section of the document. Wells sits on the Senate Environmental Committee. She's been the primary advocate for a bill that would open protected federal lands to sustainable logging practices. If that bill passes, Cascade gains access to timber rights worth over $1 billion. Robert studied the financial web displayed on the screen. So the $50 million they're laundering annually, that's not their endgame. That's just operating capital for a much bigger score. There's more. Elena opened another file. Wells' Chief of Staff, Michael Durant, owns property adjacent to the Cascade Mill. Property that was purchased through one of the same shell companies Sarah was investigating. The implications hit Robert like a physical blow. Federal environmental policy is being written by people who profit directly from destroying the environment they're supposed to protect. Elena's phone rang. The caller ID showed Agent Santos's number, but when Elena answered, the voice was different. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Agent Patricia Knox, Internal Affairs. Agent Santos has been relieved of duty pending an investigation into unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Any materials she provided to you must be returned immediately. Elena muted the phone and looked at Robert with panic in her eyes. They're shutting down the federal investigation. Robert took the phone. This is Robert Chen. What classification level are we talking about here? Mr. Chen, you need to understand that interfering with a federal investigation is a serious crime. Agent Santos exceeded her authority by sharing information about ongoing operations. What operations? Environmental crimes or something else? There was a pause. I'm not at liberty to discuss operational details, but I strongly advise you to cease all activities related to this matter and report to the Seattle FBI office for debriefing. Robert hung up and immediately removed the battery from Elena's phone. They're tracking our communications. Elena was staring at her laptop screen with a new understanding. Robert, what if this isn't about money laundering at all? What if Sarah discovered something that threatens national security? Like what? Think about it. A remote location, sophisticated security, federal protection at the highest levels. Elena pulled up satellite images of the Cascade Mill complex. What if they're not just processing money? What if they're processing something else? Robert examined the satellite photos more carefully. The mill complex included several buildings that didn't match standard lumber processing architecture. One structure in particular caught his attention, a long, low building with what appeared to be specialized ventilation systems. Elena, does this building look like a lumber processing facility to you? She studied the image. No, it looks more like a chemical processing plant. Robert's phone, an old flip phone he'd found in his grandfather's emergency supplies, rang with an unknown number. When he answered, Marcus Webb's voice was cold and professional. Chen, you and the lawyer need to stop playing detective. You're about to stumble into something that will get you both killed. Is that a threat or a warning? It's a fact. Sarah Martinez discovered information related to national security operations. Operations that certain federal agencies will kill to protect. Robert put the phone on speaker so Elena could hear. What kind of operations? The kind that fund themselves through private contractors and don't officially exist. The kind that use environmental crimes as cover for activities that would horrify the American public if they knew. Elena leaned forward. You're talking about black ops funding. I'm talking about survival, lady. Cascade isn't just laundering money for organized crime. They're laundering money for intelligence operations that Congress doesn't know about and wouldn't approve if they did. Robert felt the pieces falling into place. The $50 million annually, that's funding for what? Projects that keep this country safe from threats that never make the news. Projects that require resources the official budget can't provide. So you torture and kill journalists to protect illegal government operations. Webb's laugh was bitter. You think this is about protecting the government? This is about protecting the country from its own government. Some secrets are too dangerous for democracy. Elena grabbed the phone. Where is Sarah Martinez? Somewhere safe as long as you stop digging. But if you continue this investigation, she becomes a liability that needs to be eliminated. The line went dead. Robert and Elena sat in the cabin's silence, processing what they'd learned. If Webb is telling the truth, Elena said slowly, then Sarah didn't just uncover environmental crimes or money laundering. She discovered that Cascade is a front for funding, off-the-books intelligence. Operations. Robert examined the encrypted communication device they'd found in Marcus Webb's gear after the forest confrontation. He'd assumed it was standard security equipment, but now he recognized the frequency modulation patterns from his military days. This isn't commercial security equipment, he said, showing Elena the device. This is military-grade encrypted communication gear, the kind used for coordinating with federal agencies. Which means Webb wasn't lying about federal involvement. But that doesn't make what they're doing legal or right. Elena closed her laptop. If they're using illegal logging operations to fund Black Ops projects, then saving Sarah isn't just about protecting one journalist. It's about exposing a system of government corruption that goes all the way to the top. Robert touched his grandfather's purple heart again. Then we better make sure we're ready for a war. The sound of helicopters approaching forced Robert and Elena to abandon the cabin within hours. Robert grabbed his grandfather's military compass, a battered brass instrument from Vietnam that had guided his unit commander through enemy territory for 2 years. The needle still pointed true north despite decades of wear, its luminous dial still visible in darkness. They moved through the forest with deliberate caution, Robert using skills he hadn't employed since his army days. Elena struggled with the rough terrain and her city dweller's footwear, but she kept pace without complaint. Behind them, the sound of search teams grew closer. How many people are they using to find us? Elena whispered as they crouched behind a fallen Douglas fir. Robert counted the distinct radio frequencies bleeding through the forest. At least 3 teams, probably 6 people each. Professional search pattern, military coordination for 2 civilians. That seems like overkill. We're not civilians anymore. We're enemy combatants who threatened a national security operation. Through his grandfather's compass, Robert navigated toward a series of ridgelines that would provide both elevation advantage and multiple escape routes. The old instrument had guided countless soldiers through hostile territory, and now it was leading them through a different kind of war zone. Elena's phone, which she'd stupidly turned back on to check for messages, buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus Webb. "Don't answer it," Robert warned, but Elena was already accepting the call. "Where are you going?" "Counselor?" Webb's voice carried the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were. "You're heading toward Dead Horse Ridge, which means you're planning to circle back toward the mill. Not a bad tactical decision for amateurs." Robert took the phone.
"How are you tracking us?"
"Your lawyer friend's phone, of course. Even with the battery removed, these new devices maintain residual GPS function for 48 hours. Homeland Security requirement." Elena looked at her phone in horror, then hurled it against a tree, shattering it completely. "Too late," Webb continued through Robert's phone. "We've had your position for the last hour. But here's what's interesting. You're not running away from us. You're moving towards something." Robert ended the call and removed his own battery. They were now completely cut off from communication, but also harder to track. "He's right," Elena said. "We are moving towards something." "But what?" Robert consulted the compass again, cross-referencing with his mental map of the area. "There's an old Forest Service fire tower about 3 miles northeast, built in the 1960s, abandoned for 20 years. If it's still standing, it would give us a clear view of the mill complex, and them a clear view of us. Not if we're careful." They moved through increasingly dense forest, following game trails that rarely appeared on hiking maps. Robert's grandfather had taught him to read the subtle signs. Broken twigs that indicated regular animal passage, worn spots in the undergrowth that revealed natural corridors through the wilderness. The compass needle swung steadily as they navigated around obstacles, but its direction remained true. Robert found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories of using this same instrument during night operations in Vietnam, when getting lost meant death for an entire squad. As they climbed higher, the sound of their pursuers began to fade. Webb's teams were thorough, but not particularly skilled at wilderness tracking. They relied too heavily on technology and not enough on field craft. "Robert," Elena said during a rest stop, "what if we're wrong about the mill? What if Sarah isn't there? Then we'll have wasted time we don't have. But if she is there, and we don't try to help her, we'll never forgive ourselves, even if it gets us killed." Robert looked at the compass in his palm, its needle steady, despite everything around them changing. "My grandfather used to say that some things are worth dying for. But more importantly, they're worth living for." Elena studied the weathered instrument. How old is that thing? 50 years at least. My grandfather carried it through 2 tours in Vietnam. Said it never failed him, even when everything else did. And you trust it? I trust that it works the same way today as it did then. True north doesn't change, even when everything else does. They reached the fire tower just as the sun began to set. The structure was more intact than Robert had hoped. A metal framework rising 60 feet above the forest canopy, with a small observation cabin at the top. Most importantly, it provided an unobstructed view of the Cascade Mill complex in the valley below. Through Eleanor's binoculars, they could see unusual activity around the main administrative building. Vehicles that didn't belong to a lumber operation, including what appeared to be a medical transport van. That's not normal mill activity, Elena observed. Robert studied the pattern of movement through the binoculars. It's not mill activity at all. Look at the security positions, the checkpoint at the main gate. This is a detention facility, which means Sarah is probably there, or was there. Robert lowered the binoculars. Either way, we're going to find out tonight. Elena looked at the compass again, its needle pointing steadily toward their uncertain future. Your grandfather's compass got him through Vietnam. Think it'll get us through this? Robert smiled grimly, pocketing the instrument. Only one way to find out. Dawn brought an unexpected visitor to the base of the fire tower. Robert spotted him first through the binoculars, a man in his 50s wearing the khaki uniform of tribal police, moving through the forest with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. Police, Robert whispered to Elena, who was dozing against the tower's metal framework. She jerked awake. Cascade's people? Tribal police. Different jurisdiction. Robert watched the officers approach. He's alone, no radio chatter, and he's not trying to be stealthy. That's either very good or very bad for us. The officer stopped at the base of the tower and called up in a voice that carried natural authority. Mr. Chen, Ms. Rodriguez, I'm Chief Joseph Running Bear, Cascade Tribal Police. I think we need to talk. Robert and Elena exchanged glances. They had no choice but to trust him or try to run through terrain he knew better than they ever would. We're coming down, Robert called back. Chief Running Bear was a compact man with graying black hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime outdoors. His badge bore the seal of the Cascade Nation, and when he shook hands with Robert, his grip conveyed both strength and restraint. Agent Santos contacted me before she was removed from her investigation, Running Bear said without preamble. She was concerned that federal crimes were being committed on tribal land. Elena looked surprised. The mill is on tribal land. The mill itself, no. But the logging operations Sarah Martinez was investigating, they've been cutting timber on land that belongs to the Cascade Nation under treaties signed in 1855, running. Bear pulled a leather document case from his patrol vehicle, removing a yellowed paper protected by clear plastic. The treaty, written in formal 19th century language, clearly delineated territorial boundaries that included the areas where Cascade had been conducting illegal logging. This treaty gives the Cascade Nation sovereignty over these forest areas, Running Bear explained, which means any crimes committed there fall under federal jurisdiction through tribal authority, not local law enforcement. Robert studied the document. You're saying Sheriff Donnelly has no authority over Cascade's operations on tribal land? That's exactly what I'm saying. And more importantly, neither does anyone else in their organization. Running Bear's expression was grim, but they'd been acting like they owned the place. Elena leaned forward. What kind of acting? 3 weeks ago, our forest management team discovered clear-cutting in areas that are sacred to our people. Ancient burial grounds disturbed, ceremonial sites destroyed. When we tried to investigate, we were told it was a matter of national security and to stay away. Who told you that? Deputy Morrison, acting on behalf of federal authorities. Running Bear's jaw tightened. But we don't recognize federal authority that violates our treaty rights. Robert felt hope stirring for the first time in days. You have jurisdiction to investigate what's happening at the mill? We have jurisdiction to investigate anything that affects tribal land or tribal members. And if Sarah Martinez was investigating crimes on our territory, her safety becomes our responsibility. Elena pulled out her laptop and showed Running Bear the financial records Sarah had compiled. This is what she discovered. Cascade isn't timber operation is a front for money, laundering and possibly illegal government operations. Running Bear studied the data with the careful attention of someone accustomed to complex legal documents. $50 million annually through shell companies. That's not small-time crime. No, it's not, Robert agreed. And they've been willing to kill to protect it. Then we stop them. Running Bear's voice carried the authority of centuries of tribal sovereignty. Under federal law, crimes on tribal land can be investigated by tribal authorities in cooperation with the FBI. But we don't need Sheriff Donnelly's permission. And we don't need cooperation from local agencies that might be compromised. Elena looked at the treaty document again. You're saying you can legally investigate the mill complex? I'm saying we can legally shut down any operations that violate environmental protections on tribal land. And if we find evidence of federal crimes in the process, we're obligated to act on it. Robert studied Running Bear's expression. What do you need from us? Evidence, witnesses, and someone who knows enough about the operation to guide a tactical response team through the complex without getting anyone killed. You have a tactical team? Running Bear smiled for the first time since they'd met. Mr. Chen, the Cascade Nation has been dealing with people who think they can take our land for over a century. We've learned to be prepared. Elena closed her laptop. How do we coordinate this? First, we need to confirm Sarah Martinez is being held at the mill. Then we need to understand exactly what Cascade is doing there, besides money laundering. Running Bear folded the treaty document carefully. But we do this by the law. Our law, federal law, and international law regarding indigenous rights. Robert looked at the treaty, its faded ink representing promises made and often broken over generations. But in the hands of Chief Running Bear, it represented something more powerful, legal authority that couldn't be bought, intimidated, or corrupted. Chief, when do we start? We already have. My officers are establishing surveillance positions around the mill complex. By tonight, we'll know exactly who's there and what they're doing. Elena gathered her equipment. And then, Running Bear's expression was resolute. Then we remind some very powerful people that tribal sovereignty means exactly what it says. Elena's replacement laptop, borrowed from Chief Running Bear's tribal offices, displayed an emergency injunction filing that had taken her all night to prepare. The legal document spread across the conference table represented months of work, compressed into a single, desperate legal maneuver. Federal court in Seattle will hear our motion at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Elena explained to Robert and Running Bear, I'm requesting an immediate halt to all Cascade operations pending environmental impact review and investigation of treaty violations. Running Bear studied the filing. What are our chances? Normally? Excellent. The evidence is overwhelming, and the treaty violations are clear-cut. Elena highlighted sections of her brief. But nothing about this case has been normal. Robert examined a document that made his blood run cold. Elena, look at this EPA certificate. It's signed by Regional Director Patricia Fleming, approving Cascade's environmental impact assessment. Fleming. Elena's face went pale. She's the federal judge assigned to hear our injunction. That's not a coincidence, Running Bear said grimly. Elena pulled up the digital signature analysis she'd commissioned from a forensic expert in Vancouver. The results showed clear evidence of document manipulation, timestamps that didn't match signing dates, metadata showing multiple revisions, and most damning of all, digital signatures that had been copied from legitimate documents and pasted onto fraudulent ones. This EPA certificate is completely fake, Elena said. The signature is real, lifted from another document Judge Fleming signed last year, but everything else is fabricated. Robert studied the forensic analysis. If Fleming is involved in the conspiracy, she'll rule against us regardless of the evidence, unless we can prove her involvement before the hearing. Elena opened another file. I found this in Sarah's research, a photograph of Fleming at a private fundraiser for Senator Wells. Sitting at the same table as Cascade executives, the image showed Fleming, clearly identifiable despite the poor lighting, engaged in what appeared to be an intimate conversation with Harold Cascade, the company's CEO. The timestamp indicated the photo was taken 6 months ago, around the time Fleming would have been reviewing environmental permits for the logging operations. Running Bear examined the photograph. This proves contact, but not necessarily criminal conspiracy. There's more. Elena pulled up financial records. Fleming's husband owns a consulting firm that received $250,000 from one of Cascade's shell companies for environmental assessment services. But there's no record of any actual work being performed. Robert whistled softly. $250,000 for no work? That's a pretty clear bribe. Elena's phone rang with a call from the federal courthouse. She answered with visible apprehension. Ms. Rodriguez, this is Judge Fleming's clerk. The judge has reviewed your emergency motion and has some concerns about procedural issues. Elena put the call on speaker. What kind of procedural issues? The judge questions whether tribal authority extends to environmental crimes that may involve federal national security interests. She's requesting that all parties appear for a preliminary conference at 1 o'clock to address jurisdictional questions. After Elena hung up, Running Bear's expression was skeptical. She's trying to delay the hearing until she can coordinate with the other conspirators. Or she's trying to get us all in one place where we can be controlled, Robert added. Think about it. If we're all in her courtroom, we're all in one location that Cascade's people know about. Eleanor studied the forged EPA certificate again. But if we don't appear, she'll dismiss our motion and Cascade continues operating. Not necessarily. Running Bear pulled out his own set of legal documents. Tribal sovereignty gives us the authority to issue our own cease and desist orders for environmental crimes on tribal land. We don't need federal court approval, but without federal backing, Cascade will ignore tribal orders. Let them try. Running Bear's smile was predatory. Violating a tribal order is a federal crime that goes straight to Washington, bypassing local law enforcement completely. Robert examined the tribal documents. How long does it take to issue a tribal cease and desist order? It's already issued. Went into effect this morning. Running Bear showed them an official notice that had been delivered to Cascade's offices at dawn. They have 24 hours to halt all operations on tribal land or face federal prosecution. Elena stared at the document. You did this without waiting for the federal court? We have sovereign authority. We don't need permission from a corrupt federal judge to protect our own land. Robert felt a surge of admiration for Running Bear's tactical thinking. So now Fleming has to choose. Support Cascade and expose herself as corrupt, or enforce the tribal order and shut down the operation. Either way, we win, Elena said. If she rules against the tribal order, we have evidence of judicial corruption. If she enforces it, Cascade's operation stops. Running Bear gathered the documents. There's a third option. Fleming could declare that this case involves national security and remove it from civilian court entirely, which would mean military tribunal, classified hearings, and all evidence sealed indefinitely. Running Bear's expression was grim, at which point we'd be fighting not just corporate corruption, but a government willing to destroy its own legal system to protect black ops funding. Elena looked at the forged EPA certificate one more time. Then we better hope Fleming chooses corruption over treason. Robert's plan required precision timing and technology that hadn't existed during his grandfather's war. The modified trail camera Elena had procured from a wildlife research. Contact was no ordinary surveillance device. It captured high-resolution video and audio while transmitting data in real time to a secure server maintained by environmental activists. The meeting is set for midnight at the old logging camp, 5 miles north of the mill, Chief Running Bear explained, studying satellite images on his laptop. Our surveillance team confirmed that Marcus Webb, Sheriff Donnelly, and at least 3 federal agents will be there. Elena checked the camera's settings one final time. This device will record everything in a 30-foot radius and upload it automatically to servers in 3 countries. Even if they destroy the camera, the evidence will survive. Robert examined the meeting location through binoculars. The abandoned logging camp consisted of several deteriorating buildings surrounded by equipment that hadn't moved in decades. More importantly, it offered multiple approaches and escape routes through dense forest. Why this location? Robert wondered aloud. Because it's isolated, has no cell tower coverage for electronic surveillance, and anyone approaching can be seen from a mile away, Running Bear answered. Perfect for a meeting where powerful people don't want to be recorded. Elena reviewed the camera's technical specifications. Except they won't see this coming. The device looks like standard trail monitoring equipment, and the transmission range extends beyond their jamming capabilities. They positioned themselves 2 hours before the scheduled meeting, with Robert and Elena handling the surveillance equipment, while Running Bear coordinated with his tactical team through encrypted radio. The trail camera was concealed in a fallen log that provided clear sightlines to the camp's main building. At 11:30 p.m., vehicles began arriving. Sheriff Donnelly's patrol car, followed by a black SUV with government plates, and finally, Marcus Webb's security truck. The participants gathered in the largest building, their voices carrying clearly in the still mountain air. Through the camera's audio feed, they could hear fragments of heated conversation. The tribal order changes everything, Donnelly's voice, stress evident. We can't ignore federal jurisdiction when it comes to treaty violations. The operation is too important to shut down now, Webb responded. We're 6 months away from completing the contract. $60 million in funding for operations that Congress will never approve. A new voice, formal and clipped. The senator is concerned about exposure. If this goes public, it could destroy more than just this operation. Elena recognized the voice from news broadcasts. Senator Wells' chief of staff, Michael Durant. Then we need to clean house, Webb said. Starting with the journalist and everyone who's been helping her. Robert felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. They weren't just planning to silence Sarah. They were planning to eliminate everyone connected to the investigation. Durant's voice continued. Judge Fleming will rule tomorrow that the case involves classified national security matters. All evidence will be sealed, all participants will be bound by federal secrecy orders, and if they refuse to comply, Donnelly asked, then they'll be arrested on terrorism charges and held indefinitely under the Patriot Act. Elena grabbed Robert's arm, her face pale in the moonlight. They were listening to powerful people casually discussing the destruction of constitutional rights. Webb's radio crackled, and his voice became urgent. We have a problem. Motion sensors are picking up movement in the forest. Multiple contacts approaching from the south. Through their own surveillance, Robert could see Chief Running Bear's tactical team moving into position around the camp. But something was wrong. There were too many figures moving through the trees, and some of them weren't wearing tribal police uniforms. It's a trap, Robert whispered. They knew we'd be watching. Elena checked the camera's transmission status. The recording is uploading, but it needs another 10 minutes to complete. The meeting inside the building had devolved into chaos. Durant was shouting orders into his phone, while Webb coordinated with unseen security forces. Sheriff Donnelly seemed to be arguing for negotiation rather than confrontation. Where's the journalist? Durant demanded. Secure location. She'll be transferred once this situation is resolved, Webb replied. Transferred where? Somewhere she'll never be found. Robert made a decision that would have made his grandfather proud. Instead of retreating to safety, he activated his grandfather's emergency signal, 3 long whistle blasts that echoed across the valley. It was a sound Chief Running Bear would recognize as a warning that the operation was compromised. The response was immediate. Running Bear's voice crackled over their radio. "All units, abort surveillance. This is now a rescue operation." Webb's team burst from the building, armed and moving with military precision. But they were expecting to hunt civilians hiding in the forest, not trained tribal police officers who knew the terrain better than anyone. The firefight began with the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the mountain walls. Elena kept the trail camera recording as long as possible, capturing footage of federal agents firing on tribal police, evidence that no amount of classification could suppress. "Robert, we need to move," Elena said, grabbing the camera. "The upload is complete." As they retreated through the forest, Robert could hear Webb shouting orders over radio. "Find that camera. Whatever they recorded cannot leave this mountain." But it was too late. The evidence was already spreading across secure servers, copies being distributed to journalists and activists around the world. The conspiracy might destroy the witnesses, but they could no longer destroy the truth. Chief Running Bear's voice came over their radio one final time. "Package secured. The journalist is safe. Repeat, the journalist is safe." Elena smiled grimly as they ran through the darkness. "Sarah's alive. And now the whole world will know why they tried to kill her." The FBI raid on Cascade Timber's headquarters began at dawn, coordinated with the release of the surveillance footage that had already spread across news networks worldwide. Agent Maria Santos, reinstated after the evidence forced her supervisor's hands, led a team of federal agents who weren't compromised by the conspiracy. Robert and Elena watched from Chief Running Bear's command post as agents swarmed the mill complex. But the real confrontation was happening in a conference room inside the main building, where Harold Cascade, the company's CEO, sat across from Santos with his attorney, facing the weight of evidence that no amount of political influence could suppress. "Mr. Cascade, we have your recorded voice discussing the elimination of witnesses and the funding of illegal intelligence operations," Santos said, placing a digital recorder on the table. "Would you like to explain these conversations?" Cascade, a man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes that couldn't hide the fear in his eyes, glanced nervously at his lawyer. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Santos smiled coldly. "That's your right. But we also have financial records showing $50 million moved through shell companies, environmental crimes documented through satellite imagery, and the testimony of witnesses including Sarah Martinez." Elena entered the room, carrying a leather portfolio filled with documents. "We also have this." She placed a handwritten confession on the table, 3 pages of Harold Cascade's own writing, signed and dated from the previous night. The document detailed years of illegal activities, naming specific federal officials who had protected the operation in exchange for campaign contributions and personal payments. "Where did you get this?" Cascade's attorney demanded. "Your client wrote it last night when he thought he was going to be killed by his own partners," Elena replied. "Marcus Webb delivered it to us through intermediaries when he realized the operation was collapsing." The confession laid out the entire conspiracy in Cascade's own words. Environmental crimes to access protected timber, money laundering for off-the-books intelligence operations, bribes to federal judges and congressional staff, and most damning of all, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Santos read aloud from the confession. "I take full responsibility for ordering the attack on journalist Sarah Martinez and authorizing the murder of Deputy Morrison's wife to ensure his continued cooperation. These actions were taken to protect national security operations that I believed were essential to American interests." Cascade's lawyer was frantically reading the document. "This confession was obtained under duress. My client was in fear for his life, which doesn't make it less true," Santos replied. "And we have corroborating evidence for every claim he makes." Elena pulled out additional documents. Bank records confirming the payments to Judge Fleming's husband, Recorded conversations proving coordination with Senator Wells' staff. Environmental damage assessment showing systematic destruction of protected watersheds. The confession included details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the operation could know. Specific dates when bribes were paid. The exact locations where illegal logging occurred. Names of federal agents who had been paid to look the other way. Mr. Cascade, Santos continued. Your confession also implicates Senator Patricia Wells in campaign finance violations and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. Are you prepared to testify against her? Cascade looked at his lawyer, then at the confession he'd written in his own hand. Senator Wells knew about the money laundering. She knew about the environmental violations. She knew we were funding operations that Congress would never approve. And she participated willingly. She received detailed briefings every quarter. She personally approved the legislation that would have made our operations legal retroactively. Cascade's voice grew stronger as he realized cooperation was his only path to survival. She said the end justified the means, that protecting America required people willing to work outside the system. Elena documented every word for the record. What about the murders? Did Senator Wells know about the killings? Cascade hesitated, then nodded. When Sarah Martinez started investigating, Wells said she was a threat to national security. She gave explicit authorization for any necessary measures to protect the operation. Santos exchanged glances with Elena. They had just obtained testimony that could bring down a sitting United States senator for conspiracy to commit murder. Mr. Cascade, in exchange for your full cooperation and testimony, the Justice Department is prepared to recommend a reduced sentence, Santos said. But that cooperation must be complete and truthful. Cascade looked at his signed confession one more time. What do you want to know? Everything. Every payment, every crime, every person involved. Santos activated a video recorder. And we want it all on the record. Outside the conference room, Robert watched through one-way glass as one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Northwest detailed years of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The handwritten confession would become Exhibit A in prosecutions that would reshape environmental law and expose the dark side of off-the-books intelligence. Funding Chief Running Bear joined Robert at the observation window. Justice isn't always swift, but it's worth waiting for. Elena emerged from the conference room with the expression of grim satisfaction. He's talking. Everything from the environmental crimes to the murder conspiracy. We have enough to bring charges against 43 people, including federal officials and congressional staff. Robert thought about Sarah, recovering at a secure medical facility, and about his grandfather's lessons about courage in the face of tyranny. What happens now? Now we find out if the American justice system is stronger than the people who tried to corrupt it. The Swiss bank account records arrived via secure diplomatic pouch from Interpol, delivered to Agent Santos's Seattle office exactly 72 hours after Harold Cascade's arrest. The financial documents, stamped with official Swiss banking seals, revealed the true scope of an environmental crime network that spanned 3 decades and involved institutions across 4 countries. Elena spread the documents across the conference table while Robert and Chief Running Bear examined the intricate web of financial transactions. Each page represented years of systematic environmental destruction disguised as legitimate business operations. Cascade Timber was just one node in a much larger network, Elena explained, pointing to account numbers that connected to logging operations in Brazil, mining companies in Indonesia, and oil extraction firms in Nigeria. They've been laundering money for environmental crimes worldwide. Santos reviewed the Swiss records with the methodical attention of someone who understood their implications. These accounts show over $2 billion moved through this network in the past 5 years alone. Robert studied a transaction log that made his engineer's mind reel at the scale of coordination required. Look at the timing. Payments from the Swiss accounts correspond exactly with congressional votes on environmental legislation. They weren't just buying votes, Chief Running Bear observed. They were buying entire environmental policies. The bank records included detailed memoranda about account holders and transaction purposes. Senator Wells appeared frequently, but she wasn't the only federal official receiving payments. The documents revealed a systematic corruption of environmental oversight that reached into multiple federal agencies. Elena highlighted a section of Swiss banking notes written in precise German script. According to this, the operation was managed by something called the Environmental Solutions Consortium. But there's no record of any such organization in any corporate database, because it doesn't officially exist, Santos said grimly. It's a shadow organization that coordinates environmental crimes for profit while maintaining plausible deniability for its members. Robert found himself looking at names he recognized from news, broadcasts, federal judges, EPA administrators, congressional committee chairs, and executives from major corporations. The Swiss bankers had meticulously documented every transaction, apparently unaware that their careful record-keeping would eventually expose the entire network. "This changes everything," Elena said. Sarah's investigation didn't just uncover local corruption. She stumbled onto an international conspiracy to subvert environmental protection laws. Santos was already on her phone coordinating with federal prosecutors. "We'll need to coordinate with international law enforcement agencies. Some of these accounts are connected to environmental crimes that fall under international court jurisdiction." Chief Running Bear studied a map that showed the global reach of the conspiracy. The Cascade Nation has been fighting environmental destruction for generations, but we never imagined it was this organized. Elena pulled out a particularly damning document, a strategic plan written in English that outlined a systematic approach to undermining environmental protections worldwide. The plan detailed methods for corrupting regulatory agencies, manipulating scientific research, and eliminating witnesses who threatened the operation. "Listen to this," Elena read aloud. Phase 3. Objectives include neutralization of investigative journalism through targeted harassment and elimination of persistent threats. They've been systematically killing environmental journalists around the world. Robert felt sick as the implications sank in. Sarah wasn't just investigating local crimes. She was investigating mass murder on an international scale. The Swiss records included a list of journalists who had been neutralized in the past decade, environmental reporters in Brazil, anti-corruption investigators in Africa, and climate scientists who had asked too many questions about corporate funding of research. 23 people, Santos said, reading from the list. All died in accidents or disappeared while investigating environmental crimes connected to this network. Eleanor examined the financial flows more carefully. The money trail leads back to some of the largest corporations in the world. Energy companies, mining conglomerates, industrial agriculture. They've been funding this operation to eliminate environmental oversight. Chief Running Bear stood up, his expression resolute. "This isn't just about corruption anymore. This is about genocide, the systematic destruction of indigenous lands and the murder of anyone who tries to protect them." Santos was coordinating with federal agencies around the world, but Robert could see the challenge in her expression. The problem is jurisdiction. These crimes span multiple countries, involve international banking, and implicate officials in governments that may not want to cooperate with prosecution. Elena gathered the Swiss documents carefully. "Then we make sure the evidence gets to people who will act on it, regardless of political considerations." "Like who?" "International environmental organizations, investigative journalists in countries where press freedom still exists, and indigenous rights groups that have been fighting these same battles for decades." Robert thought about his grandfather's stories of fighting tyranny that seemed too powerful to defeat. How do you fight an enemy with unlimited resources and government protection? Elena smiled grimly, holding up the Swiss bank records. You follow the money, because no matter how powerful they are, they can't hide financial transactions from banks that keep perfect records. Santos finished her phone calls and returned to the table. I've got authorization to coordinate with Interpol, the International Criminal Court, and environmental enforcement agencies in 12 countries. This investigation just went global. Chief Running Bear nodded with satisfaction. Good, because environmental crimes don't respect national borders, and neither should environmental justice. The federal courthouse in Seattle had never seen a trial of this magnitude. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to the deceased deputy, presided over proceedings that would reshape environmental law for generations. The courtroom was packed with journalists, environmental activists, and federal officials who had traveled from Washington to witness the culmination of the largest environmental crime prosecution in American history. Elena sat at the prosecution table as special counsel, having been appointed by the Department of Justice to coordinate the complex case. Beside her, Agent Santos reviewed the final pieces of evidence that would seal the convictions of 37 defendants, including Senator Patricia Wells and 6 federal officials. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was a leather-bound federal court judgment that Judge Morrison had signed that morning, a comprehensive ruling that found Cascade Timber Industries and its co-conspirators guilty of environmental terrorism, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic corruption of federal environmental protections. Robert watched from the gallery as the judge read the verdict that vindicated Sarah's investigation and his decision to intervene in the forest that October morning. The formal judgment ran to 43 pages, but its conclusions were devastating for the defendants. The evidence presented to this court demonstrates a criminal enterprise that systematically subverted environmental protections for private profit. Judge Morrison read from the bench. The defendants engaged in conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, and corruption of federal officials on a scale that threatens the fundamental integrity of our democratic institutions. Senator Wells sat at the defense table, her political career and freedom destroyed by the evidence that Chief Running Bear's investigation had uncovered. The Swiss bank records, Harold Cascade's confession, and the surveillance footage from the forest meeting had created an airtight case that no amount of political influence could overcome. Elena stood to address the court. Your Honor, the prosecution requests that the court order immediate restitution for environmental damages, forfeiture of all assets connected to the criminal enterprise, and enhanced sentences reflecting the national security implications of the defendants' actions. Judge Morrison consulted the judgment document. The court orders the immediate dissolution of Cascade Timber Industries and forfeiture of all company assets to a federal trust fund for environmental restoration. The court further orders that all proceeds from asset forfeiture be dedicated to restoring damaged forest lands and compensating affected Native American communities. Chief Running Bear nodded with satisfaction from the gallery. The judgment specifically recognized tribal sovereignty and awarded the Cascade Nation primary authority over restoration efforts on traditional tribal lands. The judge continued reading the lengthy sentence provisions. Senator Patricia Wells is sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, and corruption of federal officials. Marcus Webb receives life imprisonment without possibility of parole for first-degree murder and domestic terrorism. Sheriff Blake Donnelly, who had cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, received 15 years for conspiracy and corruption. His cooperation had been essential in documenting the local law enforcement connections that made the conspiracy possible. Robert found himself thinking about his grandfather's Purple Heart as Judge Morrison detailed the broader implications of the case. The judgment established precedents for prosecuting environmental crimes as terrorism when they involved systematic corruption of government institutions. The court finds that environmental crimes of this scope and coordination constitute domestic terrorism under federal law, the judge declared. The systematic destruction of protected ecosystems, combined with the murder of journalists and corruption of federal officials, represents an attack on the fundamental institutions of democratic governance. Elena presented the court with restitution calculations that exceeded $500 million. Your Honor, forensic accounting has determined that the defendant's criminal enterprise generated profits of approximately $600 million through illegal logging, money laundering, and corruption of federal contracts. Judge Morrison signed additional orders requiring the restoration of over 50,000 acres of illegally logged forest land. The court appointed a special master to oversee restoration efforts, with Chief Running Bear designated as the primary tribal representative. Sarah Martinez, fully recovered from her ordeal, sat in the front row of the gallery. Her investigative series on the case had won a Pulitzer Prize and transformed environmental journalism. But more importantly, her courage had exposed a system of corruption that might have continued indefinitely without her intervention. The court commends the courage of journalist Sarah Martinez, whose investigation exposed crimes that threatened the integrity of our environmental protection systems, Judge Morrison said from the bench. The court further commends Robert Chen, whose intervention likely saved Ms. Martinez's life and enabled this investigation to proceed. As court officers led the convicted defendants away in shackles, Elena gathered the judgment documents that would become the foundation for environmental prosecutions around the world. The federal court had ruled that environmental destruction, when combined with systematic corruption, constituted terrorism under American law. Robert met Sarah outside the courthouse, where protesters and supporters had gathered to celebrate the convictions. The forest where he had first encountered her attackers was already beginning the long process of restoration, funded by the forfeited assets of the criminal enterprise. Was it worth it? Sarah asked, watching the defendants' transport vehicles disappear toward federal prison. Robert thought about his grandfather's lessons about courage and the price of justice. Ask me in 50 years, when the forests they tried to destroy are standing tall again. 6 months after the trials concluded, Robert stood in a forest clearing that bore little resemblance to the devastated landscape Cascade timber had left behind. Young Douglas fir seedlings, barely 2 feet tall, dotted the rich soil where illegal clear-cutting had once scarred the mountain. In his weathered hands, he held a single seedling that would be the 10,000th tree planted in the restoration project. Elena approached through the morning mist, carrying survey equipment for documenting the restoration progress. She had established the Pacific Northwest Environmental Law Center using part of the restitution funds, creating a permanent organization dedicated to preventing future environmental crimes. The soil analysis came back better than we hoped, Elena reported, checking readings on her tablet. The mycorrhizal networks are re-establishing faster than the forestry experts predicted. Robert knelt to plant the seedling, pressing the small root system gently into earth that had been poisoned by industrial chemicals just months earlier. The young tree represented hope in its most tangible form, proof that even the worst environmental damage could be healed with patience and proper care. Sarah Martinez emerged from a forest path, carrying camera equipment for a documentary she was producing about environmental restoration. Her investigation had evolved from exposing crimes to chronicling recovery, showing the world that environmental destruction was not irreversible. The tribal elders want to hold a blessing ceremony here next month, Sarah said, setting down her equipment. Chief Running Bear says this clearing has special significance in tribal history. Robert understood the importance of ceremony in healing. His grandfather had taught him that some wounds required more than time to heal. They required acknowledgement, respect, and conscious intention to do better. Elena consulted her restoration timeline charts. We're ahead of schedule on everything except the stream restoration. The water diversion systems Cascade installed will take another year to fully remove. But the salmon are already returning to the lower streams, Sarah added. The Fish and Wildlife Service documented spawning runs last month that haven't been seen in this watershed for 20 years. Robert stood up, brushing soil from his hands, and looked across the clearing, where dozens of volunteers worked to plant seedlings in careful patterns designed to recreate the natural forest ecosystem. Environmental groups from around the world had sent teams to study the restoration project, making it a model for recovery efforts globally. Chief Running Bear approached through the trees, accompanied by tribal elders and a group of young people learning traditional forest management practices. In his hands, he carried a small metal plaque that would commemorate the site's transformation from environmental crime scene to restoration showcase. The Tribal Council voted to name this the Robert Chen Memorial Grove, Running Bear announced. Not because anyone died, but because sometimes ordinary people do extraordinary things that deserve to be remembered. Robert felt emotion tighten his throat. Chief, that's not necessary. I just did what anyone would do. That's exactly why it's necessary, Running Bear replied. Most people think they can't make a difference against powerful interests. You proved that one person's courage can change everything. Elena read the inscription on the plaque, in honor of Robert Chen, whose intervention on October 15th led to the exposure of environmental crimes and the restoration of this forest. Sometimes the most important battles are won by ordinary people who refuse to walk away from injustice. Sarah set up her camera to document the plaque installation. This story isn't really about environmental crimes or government corruption. It's about the choice everyone faces when they encounter something wrong, to get involved, or to look the other way. Robert thought about the morning 6 months ago when he had set out for what he thought would be a peaceful hike. The trail camera evidence that exposed the conspiracy was now exhibited in the Smithsonian. The Swiss bank records had led to prosecutions in 7 countries. The federal court judgment had become a landmark precedent for environmental law, but standing in this clearing, surrounded by young trees that would outlive them all, Robert understood that the real victory wasn't the convictions or the legal precedents. It was this, the proof that destruction could be undone, that corruption could be overcome, and that individuals acting with courage could restore what seemed permanently lost. Elena finished installing the plaque while Sarah documented the ceremony for her film. The young Douglas fir seedling Robert had planted would grow for centuries, its roots intertwining with thousands of other trees to create a forest ecosystem stronger than what had existed before. As they walked back down the mountain trail, Robert thought about his grandfather's Purple Heart and the lessons about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Environmental restoration, like democracy itself, required constant vigilance and the courage to act when action was needed. The forest would remember long after they were gone, and perhaps that was the most important legacy of all. 1 year after that crisp October morning, when a retired engineer's peaceful hike changed everything, Robert Chen stood once again in the Cascade Mountains. The trail that had led him to Sarah Martinez's rescue now bore a small bronze marker embedded in a boulder, placed there by the National Park Service to commemorate what historians were already calling a turning point in environmental law enforcement. The commemorative plaque gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its inscription simple but profound. On this site, October 15th, citizen intervention led to the exposure of international environmental crimes and the restoration of protected forest lands. Individual courage and defense of justice can change the world. Robert traced the words with his finger, thinking about how a single decision to help a stranger had unraveled a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The plaque would outlast them all, reminding future generations that ordinary people possessed the power to confront extraordinary evil. Sarah approached through the trees, no longer the desperate victim he had rescued, but a confident journalist whose work had transformed environmental reporting worldwide. Her documentary about the case had won international awards and inspired a new generation of investigative reporters to pursue environmental crimes with fearless determination. The European Union passed the Environmental Terrorism Prevention Act yesterday, Sarah reported. It's based directly on the precedents established by our case. Elena says similar legislation is being considered in 12 other countries. Elena emerged from the forest path, carrying a tablet displaying the latest restoration data. The Pacific Northwest Environmental Law Center had become a model for environmental advocacy organizations worldwide, proving that legal expertise combined with grassroots courage could overcome even the most entrenched corruption. The final restoration report shows complete ecosystem recovery ahead of all projected timelines, Elena announced. The forest is actually more biodiverse now than before Cascade's illegal operations began. Chief Running Bear joined them at the commemorative site, his presence adding the weight of centuries of indigenous environmental stewardship to their gathering. The Cascade Nation had become leaders in environmental restoration technology, combining traditional ecological knowledge with modern science to heal damaged ecosystems around the world. My great-grandfather used to say that every generation faces a test of its commitment to future generations, Running Bear said, looking at the plaque. You passed the test. Robert smiled at the irony of being honored for what felt like the most natural response in the world. I just couldn't walk away from someone who needed help. That's exactly why this matters, Sarah said, setting up her camera for final shots of the memorial. Most people think they can't make a difference against powerful interests. But you proved that one person's decision to act can bring down entire criminal enterprises. The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy of restored forest that stretched for miles in every direction. Young trees planted during the restoration project were already 15 feet tall, their roots intertwining with older growth to create the complex underground networks that made forests resilient. Elena consulted her tablet once more. The restitution funds have generated enough interest to maintain restoration efforts for the next 50 years, and the legal precedents we established are being used to prosecute environmental crimes on every continent. What about the people? The ones who were convicted? Robert asked. Sarah's expression grew serious. Senator Wells died in federal prison last month. Natural causes, according to the medical examiner. Marcus Webb is serving life without parole. Sheriff Donnelly was released on compassionate grounds. He has terminal cancer. Robert felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only relief that their capacity to harm others had been permanently ended. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about ensuring that future Sarah Martinez's wouldn't need rescuing because the systems designed to protect them actually worked. As they prepared to leave the memorial site, Robert took one last look at the plaque that would remind future visitors of what had happened in these woods. The bronze would weather and age, but the message would endure. Individual courage, when combined with institutional integrity, could overcome any form of corruption. Robert, Elena said as they started down the trail, what will you do now? You've become something of a celebrity in environmental circles. Robert considered the question as they walked through forest that would outlive them all. His grandfather's purple heart waited at home, a reminder that every generation faced choices between comfort and conscience. I think I'll keep hiking these trails, he said finally. You never know when someone might need help, Sarah laughed, shouldering her camera equipment. And if they do, Robert smiled, touching the compass in his pocket that still pointed true north despite everything that had changed around them. Then I hope I'll have the courage to do what's right. The forest whispered its approval as they disappeared down the mountain trail, leaving behind a plaque that would tell their story to hikers yet unborn.